The fight and flight responses are known as a Cannon's responses. Okay, that is why I am just trying to place his picture here and try to make you aware of a personality who gave us idea on the sympathetic fight and flight responses. Yesterday I defined the autonomic nervous system. I discussed about the organizational aspects of the autonomic nervous system, and I gave the general outlay of the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous systems. And I enumerated the functions of autonomic nervous system. Though I covered, here I have mentioned, I have only outlaid the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous system. I just covered a little in detail about the enteric nervous system. Today I will be continuing with the sympathetic nervous system. And this is the plan of my lecture. The first, I just briefly compare the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Then I will discuss on various events happening at the sympathetic nerve terminal, the biochemical and physiological events. I briefly mention about the receptors. Then I will discuss the sympathetic actions on various tissues in our body. Then I briefly mention about the sympathetic control of the diurnal cycle. Then I mention about the sensory components of the sympathetic nerves. I mentioned about various sympathetic agonists and antagonists. I will give a brief idea about Cannon's fight and flight response. Then I will talk on the Horner syndrome. What I missed here, I also give you the functions of the sympathetic system. Just to make you aware that sympathetic response is a fight and flight response. You can just see that yes for stress. Sympathetic is for stress. Stress may be your examination is one of the stress, or something bothering you, or something suddenly you may fall down, that is a stress, accident, and we are all now associated with the stress of the COVID-19, so on. This is the stress. So this sympathetic response is for the stress. Whereas, look, here is another cartoon. In this, the person is sleeping. This is peace, the P for peace there. So he is sleeping. It is a parasympathetic response. Rest and digest. The fight and flight, sympathetic. Rest and digest is the parasympathetic. Sympathetic neurons are located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, in the thoracolumbar segments. They comprise of the preganglionic fibers, a synapse, that is ganglion, and postganglionic fibers, postganglionic neuron, which emerge as a postganglionic fibers. The preganglionic fibers are thinly myelinated fibers with a diameter of 2 to 3 micrometers and a conduction velocity ranging around 5 meters per second, 5 to 8 meters per second. The postganglionic fibers are unmyelinated, have a diameter of 0.3 to 1.3 micrometers with a conduction velocity ranging between 0.7 to 2.3 meters per second. The major difference in the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are listed in the next table. In this table, I have listed them. First, anatomical location and organization. If you are looking at that parameter, they are thoracolumbar, sympathetic or parasympathetic, craniosacral, that is cranial nerve, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerve. And also in the sacral segments 2 to 4. They have the preganglionic fibers in sympathetic, short, paravertebral. That means in the paravertebral chains, they are short, vertebral, and those supplying the adrenal medulla, they are long. Otherwise, most of them are short. Here in the parasympathetic, they are long. The transmitter released here is acetylcholine from the preganglionic terminal of sympathetic. So is the case with the parasympathetic. The transmitter released is acetylcholine. The postsynaptic receptor, nicotinic type of acetylcholine receptor, which is a iontophoretic receptor which acts as an ion channel. This is a ligand. Acetylcholine sits on the ligand and opens up the ion channels, cation channels. Same thing here in case of parasympathetic. Preganglionic fibers, excepting for their length, otherwise the synaptic properties are similar. Then the ganglion. So now, where is the ganglion? Ganglion is away from the organ. I'm looking organ or the end organ is the thing. It is not in the end organ. It is away from the organ. Exception is adrenal medulla in this case, because in the adrenal medulla, the preganglionic fibers coming in the splanchnic nerve, they directly reach the adrenal medulla, and adrenal medulla is treated as a synapse and release enormous amount of adrenaline. Whereas if you are looking at a parasympathetic nerves, these ganglion or synapses are situated in the organ itself. Then they're coming back with a postganglionic transmitter or postganglionic neuron and its transmitter. The postganglionic fiber here in the sympathetic nervous system is longer, whereas it is shorter here in parasympathetic. And here it releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. And mostly norepinephrine, 90% norepinephrine from the sympathetic terminals, and it is epinephrine, greatly epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And as an exception, acetylcholine in the sweat glands. These are called pseudomotor, S-U-D-O, pseudomotor nerves. Here in this case, parasympathetic, it is acetylcholine. Now, the receptors, the norepinephrine is with alpha receptors and beta receptors, alpha and beta receptors. The acetylcholine here is a muscarinic receptor. This muscarinic receptor is a G protein coupled receptor. Now, just about what happens with the ganglion blockers. Ganglion blockers are the agents which block the ganglion, this here. If you block it, that means it will reduce the activity of both. You can just see that. So now, why I am trying to bring the ganglion blocker here? Just to give you an idea that nicotine, that is the alkaloid present in the tobacco, that means smoking I have written here. The nicotine will activate the ganglion. And this activation of the ganglion enhances the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, sympathetic nervous system. Also, it enhances the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system because it is present in all ganglion. So either here and here, you just see that it will stimulate that. And another important part, if there is a greater amount of nicotine, excessive amount of nicotine, so excessive amount of nicotine would produce a depolarization of the postsynaptic or postganglionic receptor or the membrane. Whereas if you are looking at this component, sympathetic component, wherein it will increase the adrenal medulla is a large area, and once the adrenal medulla is activated, there would be the enormous amount of adrenaline poured into the system. So that means the adrenaline poured into the system. So adrenaline has a half-life, and till that goes and that does action, that is what it wants to, or it is required to do. So this increases the adrenal medullary activity. So that means whenever a person starts smoking and smoking, so maybe he may add nicotine levels, and that may enhance the adrenal medullary activity or sympathetic activity. Okay, so now having considered something about the nicotine, we move on to the next part. What are the various events happening at the postganglionic noradrenergic terminal, and this is the receptor after that. The transmitter released in the postganglionic this thing is norepinephrine, and this norepinephrine is metabolized by the catechol O-methyl transferase. Catechol O-methyl transferase, it is metabolized, and that would be converted to norepinephrine, and this norepinephrine is not active. This norepinephrine sits on these receptors, either alpha receptors or beta receptors. These are known as alpha or beta adrenoceptors. So that brings about the action in the postsynaptic tissue. Okay. Now, the action of the norepinephrine is limited by its reuptake mechanism because there are transporters. These transporters are norepinephrine membrane transporters. They are located here on the presynaptic junction, and they come back and they are recycled. So within the prejunctional neuron, we have this another enzyme, monoamino oxidase. This monoamino oxidase, it keeps this environment free of excessive norepinephrine. That means the free norepinephrine here is deaminated and recycled. So this noradrenaline is synthesized from an amino acid tyrosine. Tyrosine is converted into dopa to dopamine, dopamine to norepinephrine. I have two things, COMT, that's a catechol O-methyl transferase, and monoamino oxidase. Suppose if you block this monoamino oxidase inhibitor, so that means this is full of norepinephrine. Suppose you block this, you have a norepinephrine levels increase at the synaptic gland. Just giving you some idea about the things. Now, moving on to the next same continuation of the previous slide. Here it's more complicated diagram of the synapse. This is a neuron secreting the norepinephrine, and these dots are the norepinephrine molecules, and they are there in the vesicle, and these are vesicle monoamino transporters. So by the vesicle monoamino transporters, they are put into the in this vesicle molecule, and this is where it starts. One is synthesis. The second is a formation of secretory granules. This is secretory granules. Then third is the exocytosis. That's the release. Then acting on receptor. That means these are the receptors. These are adrenoceptors, maybe alpha, maybe beta, and now they will act upon that, and they will bring about the action through the second messengers. Then we have here the uptake. That means this is a neurotransmitter transporter. That means norepinephrine transporters back into the cell, and this back into the cell that brings it, and then that would again reutilized for the package through the Golgi complex, and that is recycled. So in between you have a COMT here because the excessive norepinephrine is not good, and here they keep this terminal clean, MAO monoamino oxidase is required. Okay, so now briefly mentioning about that, these are the various the broad differences in the adrenergic receptors and their function. Now we have two type of major receptors, the alpha receptors and beta receptors. Again, alpha receptors may be divided into alpha 1 and alpha 2, and beta receptors again beta 1 and beta 2 or beta 3. So now alpha receptors, what they do, they produce vasoconstriction, they produce the pupillary dilatation, they produce intestinal smooth muscle relaxation, and they produce intestinal sphincter contraction. The sphincter is maybe you can think about the pyloric, or you can think about the ileocecal, or you can think about the internal anal sphincter. The beta receptors, they produce vasodilatation, they produce cardio acceleration, increases the heart rate, they produce increased myocardial strength. That means the contraction, that is beta 1 receptors. Intestinal relaxation, beta 2. So this also produces intestinal relaxation, this also produces. Uterus relaxation, beta 2. The bronchodilation, beta 2. The calorigenesis, beta 2. Glycogenolysis, breakdown of the glycogen from the liver. Especially it is not from the liver, adrenaline acts on the muscle, mostly on the muscle. From the liver it is glucagon. Glucagon and the adrenaline, they have a similarity in their action. So glucagon, the area is limited to liver. The adrenaline area is unlimited. It is all parts of the body. So glycogen here, glycogenolysis, and even gluconeogenesis. That means the lipolysis. Lipolysis means lipids are broken down, and these broken down lipids are converted to glucose, and this glucose provides the energy. And bladder wall relaxation. These are the beta receptor functions. So I have listed here the functions of the alpha receptor and the beta adrenoreceptors. Now moving on, what are the sympathetic actions on the various tissues or various systems? One, in the eyes, the radial muscles of the iris, they get contracted. By contracting, so they produce the dilatation of the pupil. Dilatation of the pupil, and dilatation of the pupil is known as a mydriasis. I have used the terminology mydriasis is the dilatation of the pupil. This results from the contraction of the radial muscles, and sympathetic nerves, they do it. What happens? The sympathetic nerves are coming from the cervical ganglion. Cervical ganglion is situated here, and that reaches the sympathetic through. It will reach the radial muscles there. And this sympathetic, suppose if there is anything happening here, if this cervical ganglion is destroyed, so this dilatory response is absent. So then the pupils become constricted. That is the condition in which what is known as a Horner syndrome. I will briefly describe in the later stage. On the sympathetic action on the heart, the first on the heart, on the SCA node, it will involve a beta 1 receptor, and it will increase the heart rate. How does it increase the heart rate? It increases the slope of the prepotential. You know, the prepotential is the potential in the SCA node before the arrival of the SCA action potential. And this prepotential is also known as a diastolic depolarization, because the resting potential of the SCA node is never resting. It is once it comes back, it again starts depolarizing, and the depolarization happens at a particular slope. So this is called a prepotential till it reaches the firing level. So now this increases the slope of the prepotential. That means the rate of rise of the prepotential is faster, so that it reaches the critical level of firing, and then produces the SCA node potential, and that produces the heart rate. So that means it increases the heart rate by increasing the slope of the potential. As against, in case of acetylcholine decreases the slope of the potential, or it will keep the potential at the same level. So it does not allow the depolarization to happen. So that is the comparison. Now, that is the SA node increases the heart rate by increasing the slope of the prepotential. Atria and ventricular muscles, the beta 1 receptors and beta 2 receptors, both are involved, and they increase the contractility of the atria and the ventricular cardiac muscle. And this is attributed to the cyclic AMP calcium mediated mechanism. You know, caffeine, it's a phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor. Phosphodiesterase is an enzyme which inactivates cyclic AMP into 5-AMP. So caffeine is an inhibitor of the phosphodiesterase 4, wherein CAMP is not inactivated by the phosphodiesterase, so that CAMP remains. If CAMP remains, it gets activated on the heart. It increases the cardiac contractility. Moving on further, the atrioventricular node and the Purkinje fibers, there are beta 1 and beta 2 receptors. They will increase the conduction velocity. That's again through the calcium conductance. So that is about the sympathetic action on the heart. Now, action on the blood vessels. Here I have listed the blood vessels of the coronary, skin, skeletal muscle, abdominal viscera, salivary glands, renal system, and systemic veins. So that means on the coronaries, we have alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. They produce constriction. The sympathetic stimulation produce constriction if they are on the alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. And if the sympathetic beta 2 receptors are activated, this is dilatation. In general, what happens when you are activated, or when your adrenergic system is activated, if there is only adrenaline, so adrenaline stimulates both. It has both alpha and beta. Almost, it stimulates both. If you are thinking about norepinephrine is predominantly alpha. And if it is predominantly alpha, any sympathetic activation, what it does, it produces the coronary constriction. And coronary constriction means what? It compromises the circulation to the cardiac muscle. In the cutaneous blood vessels, it is alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. They produce constriction. So that means whenever sympathetic activity is there, they will produce the constriction of the entire cutaneous, because this blood flow is not required. The blood flow somewhere else may be required. Now, skeletal muscle blood vessels, what happens? Again, it has alpha 1 and beta 2. Alpha 1 produces constriction and beta 2 produces dilatation. Now, abdominal viscera, this produces alpha 1 produces constriction. Salivary glands, it produces constriction. Alpha 1 and alpha 2 produces constriction. Renal arteries, alpha 1 are renal afferent arteries or efferent arteries, constriction. Again, the renal arterial dynamics is something different. They have another system, renin-angiotensin system is operating upon. So that's the thing. But the alpha 1 receptors in the renal artery, they produce constriction. So systemic veins, alpha 1 and 2 produce constriction. By constriction, they increase the venous return. Beta 2 produces dilatation. Overall, if I have to take up the message from this entire slide or entire discussion here in this slide, so you just see that alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors are constrictors and beta receptors are dilators. So that is the take-home message for you. So alpha receptors constrict and beta dilate. That's the message. Okay, now coming back with the sympathetic actions on different things. First, on the bronchial muscles. The bronchial muscles are expressed with the beta 2 receptors. So, say for example, we have the adrenaline having a beta action that produces the relaxation. Isoprenolol, the beta receptor agonists, and that would help the perfect relaxation. In the stomach, in terms of motility and the tone of the stomach or gastric muscle, the alpha 1 and alpha 2 and beta 2, they decrease. They decrease the motility, they decrease the tone. The sphincters, the alpha 1 produces contraction. The sphincter here is a pyloric sphincter. Secretion of the stomach, the receptors don't know, but that would decrease. However, I want to add one note here. The glands in the pyloric end, especially the mucus glands, they are excited by the sympathetic activity. Because this mucus is protective against the acid pipes in digestion of the thing. So that means that's one part. Though the secretion as such decreases, but at the pyloric end, there may be an increase in the mucus. This is selective mucus secretion. Then coming back with the intestine, the motility and tone, they decrease. They project onto the acetylcholinergic fibers and they inhibit the cholinergic fibers. The sphincters, they produce a contraction. The sphincters here in the intestine, one sphincter is a ileocecal sphincter, that is where the ending of the intestine into the cecum, that is the beginning of the large intestine, and in the internal anal sphincter, this is alpha 1, which is contraction. Then about the intestinal secretion, alpha 2 decreases the intestinal secretion. Coming to gallbladder is potentially monitored by the humoral stimulation. 90% is humoral. Acetylcholine increases, that is the cholinergic fiber, the vagus, and the sympathetic fibers, these sympathetic fibers, the beta 2 receptors, they decrease the gallbladder activity. This is about the bronchial tissue, the stomach. These are intestinal smooth muscle and the various factors. Then coming back to this genitourinary system and skin. The urinary bladder, if you see, detrusor muscle is activated by beta, relaxed by the beta 2 receptor activation by the sympathetics. There is a relaxation of the detrusor muscle that is holding on the urine. Detrusor muscle is the muscle of the bladder. Then sphincter vesicae remains contracted. The alpha 1 receptors, that means that would activate the contraction of the sphincter vesicae. Okay, so this is the point to be noted. The sphincter vesicae, that the alpha 1 receptor activity is the first one to recover in case of the spinal cord injuries. So that means the sphincter vesicae remain contracted. So there is no emptying of the bladder and there is a retention of urine. That's a complication. Okay, I'm trying to give you the applied perspective about how this is involved. Now, uterus is exclusively rather governed by the hormonal influences, especially the oxytocin, the prostaglandins, the estrogen and the progesterone. They are predominantly, mainly responsible for the uterine contractility or uterine myometrial contractility. But in the body, the myometrial contractions, the alpha 1 receptors produce contraction in pregnant uterus. So these are conditions: the pregnant uterus, Pregnant uterus means the high levels of the estrogen and progesterones are very, very high, and in that condition the alpha-1 receptor activation may produce the contraction. So in another situation in the body, that means it's not pregnant, it may produce the relaxation. That is about uterus. Seminal vesicle, if you are looking at seminal vesicle and vas deferens, vas deferens spelling is there in NSG, NS. The muscles of the seminal vesicle and vas deferens, they are contracted by the sympathetic, and that is the what we call it as a ejaculation reflex in case of males. So this is mediated through alpha-1 receptors. So they are necessary for ejaculation. Suppose a person who have been sympathectomized, or who have been receiving sympathetic alpha-1 receptor antagonists, then what happens? This ejaculation may not take place. So that means he will not be able to empty the seminal vesicle or vas deferens. That means during the copulation, the ejaculation of the semen, that cannot take place. That is one of the issue with the alpha-1 receptor antagonist prescribed to a person, and this is what may happen. So then cutaneous actions, the pilomotors, because in the skin we have two things. One, the hair follicles, hairs having some muscles, these pilomotors, these are hair muscles, and these pilomotors are activated by alpha-1 receptors. That means sympathetics, they produce contraction. When they produce contraction, the hairs will become erect. That means the erection of the piloerection takes place. So whenever you are sympathetically active, you can see that your hairs are rising up. So then the sweat glands, what happens? It would increase the secretion of sweat. So especially certain areas, very small, relatively certain increase, especially localized to the palm of the hand. The palm of the hand, wherein some persons, some of us are having that particular thing. That means all the time this palm is having a sweat. That means it's wet. So this is because of the alpha-1 receptor activation of the sweat glands here. But the overall generalized the secretions, the sweating which happens in case of the summer because of the heat, and in response to the heat, to produce that heat loss mechanism, it comes from the another set of glands. These are another set of neurons. These are cholinergic sympathetic cholinergic fibers supplying the sweat glands. They produced a generalized increased secretion, and large amount. This comes a large amount of secretion, and they are diluted because the sweat is coming with electrolytes. That means you don't want to lose the electrolytes. So this is the response what happens to us in summer when I am exposed to a heat environment, to reduce the heat, because this sweat it is having a surface cooling effect, and that is what it does. So this is through the muscarinic receptors. Acetylcholine muscarinic receptors produce a large amount. It is generalized. Now coming back with the metabolic organs and the endocrine exocrine glands. Now liver is a metabolic hormone. These hepatocytes are activated by the alpha-1 and beta-2 receptors. They produce a glycogenolysis. So the glycogen is broken down mainly by but this glycogenolysis in the liver is brought about by the glucagon, but adrenaline also does it. It cannot prevent it. So that's one part. However, the adrenaline's primary action is on the skeletal muscles, and wherein the glycogen present in the muscle is divided, glycogenolysis, and the glucose is released for utilization. Then adipose tissue. In the adipose tissue, there are two types of fats, one white fat and brown fat. The white fat that provides the energy, that is the storing, so that lipids are stored, alpha 2 and beta 3 receptor activation that would produce the breakdown of the lipid molecules, which is stored as a white fat, and that is partly some amount of calorie production because of the fat metabolism. Brown fat, especially which is present in infants, this brown adipose tissue, what's called a brown adipose tissue, through the beta 3 receptors, this would be exclusively for calorigenesis. It's nothing to do with these metabolic functions of the glucose, fat, and protein metabolism. So it increases the beta 3 activation, increases the production of the heat, the calorigenesis. Then the pancreas. The pancreas alpha receptors, there are alpha receptors that are expressed, and they decrease the secretion of the exocrine function, the secretions in terms of the zymogen granules that is present in the secreting trypsin and trypsin containing molecules, all the protein, digestive and other digestive enzymes, zymogen glands, and or the duct system that secretes the bicarbonated water. So those are decreased by the alpha receptors. In case of endocrine pancreas, alpha 2 receptors inhibits the secretion of these beta cell, and to an extent they inhibit the secretion of the other hormones of the endocrine function. Mainly, the pancreas secretes two hormones, mainly, that is insulin and glucagon. One is trying to conserve, one is trying to increase. Besides that, there is a somatostatin and pancreatic peptide Y. So these are hormones secreted by the endocrine pancreas. So they will try to inhibit the alpha 2 activation, that would inhibit. Whereas if you are looking at the parasympathetic, they will increase. Salivary glands. You must have seen in the salivary glands, the parotid glands is mainly serous gland. The submandibular and sublingual glands are mixed glands. Especially the sublingual glands is greatly mucous. Submandibular is 50-50, and parotid is greatly serous. So now what happens to the mucous glands? The activation of sympathetics at alpha 1, because they are expressed with alpha 1 receptors, that would produce a thick viscous secretions. The activation of the serous glands, that would beta 2 receptors, that would increase the enzyme secretion, especially the salivary amylase secretion from the serous glands. This is about salivary glands. Then skin. Skin have three components already. You have come: pilomotor, the contraction, alpha 1 receptors, the sweat glands. I mentioned about slight and localized, and generalized copious dilute secretion. Now coming back, the diurnal variation, that means we have day-to-day fluctuations. Say for example, the diurnal variations are dependent from a molecule secreted from the pineal gland. This is a pineal gland here, and this pineal gland secretes melatonin. How does it secrete melatonin? So the input for the melatonin, because if you are looking at the melatonin level decreases during daytime and increases during night. So how this thing happens? See, say for example, in the daytime, we have this photic stimulation. This photic stimulation does not go here. That means through the retina. That means retina have another parallel pathway. That means this photic stimulation goes to the hypothalamus. Usually the light, what we see, the visual sensation is carried, or the signals are carried through the thalamus somewhere here, and this thalamus, from the thalamus, then it will reach to the occipital cortex. This is the occipital cortex. So that means from the eye they reach the thalamus and the occipital cortex. That is what the visual signal, the image formation. Whereas these photic signals also, some of those, they will reach the hypothalamus. In the hypothalamus, this area is known as a suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is the master gland or master center for the diurnal activity, or all the cyclical activities. So now, as the light activates retina during daytime, the signal reaches suprachiasmatic neuron in the hypothalamus. This is suprachiasmatic nucleus, through the retinohypothalamic pathway. So other one was a retinothalamic I was trying to talk about, that is visual. Then suprachiasmatic nucleus, because in the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is having a inhibitory connections with the paraventricular nucleus. So that means suprachiasmatic nucleus inhibits the paraventricular nucleus. So it is through the GABAergic mechanism. So that means this is sort of a reciprocal in nature. So now this paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. This is one of the nucleus of the hypothalamus, and this is another nucleus of the hypothalamus. They are talking to each other. And paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus talks to the sympathetic superior cervical ganglion here. So the outputs from the hypothalamus, that is the paraventricular nucleus, reach here. So what is the type of the outputs? It would stop, or it will decrease the tonic activity of the sympathetic system, which is reaching to the pineal gland. So now the paraventricular nucleus interrupts the tonic activity of the sympathopineal fibers. That means from the sympathetic superior cervical ganglion, it is going to the sympathetic thing. Thus decreases the activity of the pineal gland, leading to low melatonin secretion during daytime. So that means, I repeat, light activates retina, signals reach suprachiasmatic nucleus, and the retina and suprachiasmatic pathway is a retinohypothalamic pathway. Then suprachiasmatic nucleus inhibits the paraventricular nucleus. The paraventricular nucleus interrupts, so that means it has a connection with the superior cervical ganglion. It interrupts the activity coming, the tonic activity coming from the superior cervical ganglion to the pineal gland. So that means a sympathopineal excitatory signals. It stops. If it is stopped, melatonin secretion decreases. If the melatonin secretion decreases, that would be in the daytime. As the sun sets, so this input is not there, the photic stimulation is not there, and thus the melatonin starts building up, and it reaches to a particular level, and that may induce sleep. There are so many things happening, maybe that's more complex right at this point of time. Now the sympathetic pathway involved in this the pineal glands are expressed with the beta-1 and alpha-1 receptors. So here, through the beta-1 and alpha-1 receptors, they are producing that melatonin secretion. Now, another thing I wanted to mention here, the various sensory components. Here, the parasympathetic, this is the line drawn here. So all the organ systems above this line are carried by the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerve. Sympathetic is concerned with this middle portion, lumbar, these things, wherein the sensory part of the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder, the intestine, and the part of the colon up to the middle portion, and some part of these distal segment of the colon. So this is also supplied by the sympathetics are supplying this, and they are taking up to this level from T11 to L1, so T7 to T9 here, and this is by the splanchnic nerve, and T9 to T, because the segments indicate whatever the reference of the particular thing. Say, for example, if you are trying to talk about the areas, this lumbar area, suppose if it is happening colon, you have a pain here. If the spasm here, it is the lumbar segments that produces. See, for example, here on the back you will have a pain. Similarly, here T10 to 11 is supplied by the ureter. So that would be again producing the lumbar back pain. So like that. So this is the type of pain sensation carried by the various viscera. So now if you are looking at the lungs here, lungs, they are supplied by the various segments, the intercostal segment, and this part is supplied by the phrenic nerve. Okay, that is the representation of the various organs. Now, if you come here, you just see that uterus. In the uterus, what you have T11 to L1. So that means the pain here, the sensory information is going here, converging on the pain fibers of the back, and you have a backache. You have a backache or a spasm. So you have a backache. So all these just I'm trying to give you an idea. So that means any of these structures, irritation or inflammation of any of these structures would produce that particular segments to be operated upon. So this is the innervation. So this is a specific function because the sensation is carried by this sympathetic division of the autonomic system. Now, fight and flight response of canine. So I'm just enumerating the brain, especially the amygdala in the limbic system, receives information and reacts to the threat. So threat is either it's in a danger situation, or there is something which I need to run away because I faced a beast in which is chasing me. So that is the thing. And then in that case, whatever the impulse is, they will go to the brain areas, and then amygdala analyzes along with hippocampus and other prefrontal areas, and that amygdala takes a decision, and it reacts to the threat, and it sends impulses to the hypothalamus, and hypothalamus in turn activates the sympathetic nervous system. It's a very peculiar here. It's not a generalized activation of the entire sympathetic nervous system. It is especially the activation of the adrenal medullary sympathetic system. So now the adrenal medullary output enhanced. So it is very peculiar. This hypothalamus selectively activates the adrenal medullary output. And this adrenal medullary output increases the level of the adrenaline, and that is preparing for that would be necessary for the fight or flight response. And this is called acute stress response. This reaction is very rapid because you cannot consume time, otherwise your existence is at stake, and it happens unconsciously because even before you think about it, things are happening. Adrenaline adds strength momentarily. That means you want to run away, that provides the blood supply to the muscle, that provides the motivation, and that increases the reaction time, so on. So that means it increases the strength. If the threat goes on, if it remains forever, so then hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis is activated. What is this hypothalamo? This is an endocrine axis. Hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal cortex. So now this hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis releases the another set of hormones. This is a cortisol, because in this first response, adrenaline is only mobilizing glucose. The cortisol, because the constant stress, the chronic, it is going into chronic stress, then there should be an adaptation to the stress. The cortisol is released. Cortisol provides a number of other metabolic things, including the increased glucose level. And when the threat goes away, the parasympathetic nervous system begins and return the body back to balance. This is about a fight and flight response. And let us see it. What happens? The adrenaline surges there. There is a sudden gush of adrenaline. And sudden gush of adrenaline increases the cardiorespiratory activity. Heart rate increases, the blood pressure increases, the cardiac output increases. There is an increase in the cardiovascular activity. Now the respiration increases. There is a dilatation of the bronchioles so that more and more air is accommodated. Nervous system is activated. There is a generalized arousal response. You are awake, wide awake. The endocrine, it will stimulate the pituitary, thyroid, adrenal cortex activation. The metabolism, because for all these things energy is required, that activate gluconeogenesis, that is the production of a glucose from other source than carbohydrate. So that's from lipids and proteins, the glucose is formed. This is gluconeogenesis, and also produces the calorigenesis, that is the heat is produced. At the same time, it will activate the lipolytic, it will break down the lipids, lipolytic, proteolytic, and that also glycogenolytic. All those lytic enzymes are activated. That would increase the glucose levels. The immune system is temporarily suppressed. The skeletal muscles are tense, and sometimes you may find a fine tremors. The muscle tone is increased. The person is ready to run because he is running. The dilatation of the pupil, because of this pupil or because of the adrenaline, the dilator pupillae are activated, and the dilatation of the pupil. And the dry mouth, what happens? Because of this thing, there is a secretion is decreased. Secretion is decreased, and even if there is a secretion, that secretion is a viscous secretion or a mucus secretion. I mentioned coming from the sublingual gland, you may not be able to swallow, and it activates the sweating mechanism. And all these things are a fight or flight response of canine. Okay, so now this one will see. So there is a dilatation of the pupil, sweating, and the metabolic activity, the cardiac activity, the respiratory activity, and all these things are because of the adrenal surge. Then here I am listing the functions of the sympathetic nervous system. I just read them. The sympathetic system is essential to handle the challenging and stressful situations. This is required because that prepares our body to deal with the situation. And it's especially required to handle the unexpected emergency situations. What we talk about a Cannon's reaction, the fight and flight responses. These emergencies require the sympathetic activation is a must, and it required. And it regulates, I mentioned, it regulates the diurnal activity via retino-hypothalamo-sympathopineal circuits. I mentioned about that circuits. It increases the heat production. That means it enhances the calorigenesis activity. It acts as a general metabolic stimulant. Okay, the major metabolic stimulant is the thyroid gland or thyroxine, but it also increases the metabolic activity, and this metabolic activity is because of the production of a more glucose, and more glucose is available for energy. It has a glucogenolytic and gluconeogenesis activity. These are two things. Glucogenolytic, that is a glycogen is broken down. Gluconeogenesis, that is the production of a glucose from other sources other than the carbohydrate. So lipolytic activity produces glucose and proteolytic activity produces glucose. Sensitizes various physiological responses at cellular level. So that means all the enzyme reactions and every activity is sensitized so that they are happening at a faster rate. Produce a generalized arousal response or alert response of the nervous system. You are very alert, trying to look at the situation. Suppose if you are walking there and if a dog starts chasing you, then that is the response of cannon. Then how you save yourself, you only know, and nobody can know it. So that is generalized arousal response. What you do, you look back into the thing and see that a dog is, where is dog and how much far it is or how near it is, something like that. So arousal response. They regulates the blood pressure and other cardiovascular functions. It regulates the smooth muscle functions. The sympathetic system regulates the smooth muscle function and the sphincteric activity, especially the sphincters of the bowel, bladder, and the it also releases the seminal vesicle, that is the ejaculation reflex. It regulates the entry of light into the retina or the eye. It regulates the secretion of endocrine and exocrine glands, I have mentioned. It also transmits sensory impulses arising from the thoracolumbar or thoracoabdominal structures supplied by this thoracolumbar outlet. So these are some of the functions. I've already mentioned about the modulation of the ganglion blockers. So nicotine is one of the ganglion blocker that produces the depolarization and depolarization blocker. And we have another blocker, guanethimide. So that means that is a ganglion blocker. Nowadays, we don't use the ganglion blocker. So once upon previously, they were trying to block it. Now, the blockers of the alpha receptors, I'm just giving a reference, prazosin and pentolamine. These are blockers of the alpha receptors. I am giving a general plan. In pharmacology, will be dealt with alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. So the main thing. So now beta blockers, propranolol, depleting the sympathetic transmitter depleting drug, that is reserpine. Reserpine is a Ravelfia alkaloid, and it depletes the terminals containing the catecholamines that will deplete all the catecholaminergic terminals. Then neurotoxicity by the 6-hydroxydopamine destroys the catecholaminergic neurons. Then the injection of anti-serum against the nerve growth factor results in a total destruction of sympathetic ganglia. So that means it produces what's called immunosympathectomy. This is about broadly about sympathetic modulations. Here I have listed these adrenergic agonists. This is taken from the Goodman and Gilman, and these adrenergic agonists are direct, mixed, indirect. Now see these direct, they are selective, non-selective. The main selective is the phenylephrine here, and oxymetazoline, or the isoprene, beta 2. Then mixed acting, that means all things by the ephedrine. Ephedrine is alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Now indirect action, that is the releasing agents. Amphetamine releases the sympathetic transmitters. So that means that keeps you awake. So amphetamines were the drugs used for keeping oneself awake. So then uptake inhibitors, cocaine. Cocaine is an uptake inhibitor. So then we have a siliglene, is a MOA inhibitors. I was trying to talk about MOA inhibitors. Then I mentioned about COMT inhibitors and sympatholytics, alpha adrenergic antagonists are pentolamine and phenoxybenzaimine. Alpha 1 by prazosin. Alpha-2, tolazolene, euhambine, and these things. What I want to remain here, alpha adrenergic, pentolamine, I want to remember with prazosin, I want to remember with the tolazolene. So beta receptor antagonists are the propranolol and atenolol, timolol, esmolol. So this is a propranolol is the one which I want you all to remember. These are known as the sympatholytics. Horner syndrome is a triad of three things. One, meiosis, constriction of pupil; ptosis, drooping of the upper eyelid; and the anhidrosis, the absence of sweating in the face. It is caused by damage to the sympathetic nerves of the face, usually the lesions of the cervical ganglia, because anything in the cervical ganglia that will, if it is destroyed because of any other things, that may result in a Horner syndrome. I described about the sympathetic nervous system and its necessity for a fight and flight response. I described the various actions mediated by alpha and beta receptors. I described about the sympathetic nerves effects on eye, smooth muscles of blood vessels, respiratory tract, GIT, urinary bladder, heart, and I mentioned about the metabolic actions of the sympathetics, thermogenesis, control of sphincters, seminal vesicles, and what's the difference? The sympathetic control of the diurnal cycle and the afferent signaling pathways I mentioned. I mentioned briefly about the various sympathetic agonists and antagonists. That itself is a chapter. I don't want to get myself lost there. And it is an important thing with the fight and flight response of the canine. Horner syndrome, I briefly touched upon, and this is because of the lesion in the cervical ganglia. Keywords for today's topic is fight and flight response, Horner syndrome, sympathetic action on heart muscle, sympathetic action on pacemaker activity, sympathetic control of diurnal variations, sensory functions of the sympathetic nerves, sympathetics on exocrine glands, and functions of the sympathetic nerve, and many more. In the next class, I will take about the parasympathetic nervous system. These are the reference books from Candle's Neuroscience, Guyton's Textbook of Physiology, Genong's Review of Medical Physiology. Thank you all.